Hello students, welcome to our discussion of ethics in behavioral research. I will turn this off in just a second. Alright, I just wanted to make sure I recorded this entire lecture and I realized that I had accidentally double clicked when I pressed start the recording. So it recorded like a half a second worth of content and I went through the entire lecture, all my examples, excited discussion, and then I realized none of it had been saved. So let's go over ethics and behavioral research right now. And I'm going to double check again, or triple check now at this point, that it is recording. Perfect. All right, it looks like it's actually working, so let's continue. We're going to start with a discussion of Milgram's study of obedience. You may have seen this in your general psych class. You've probably talked about it. You've probably heard of this Milgram study. So let's talk about it and why this was an ethically problematic study and why it was one of the studies that helped lead to the creation of IRBs, or institutional review boards. So I already have this video up because I already watched it once today.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
All right, so as we've discussed in the history of psychology, a lot of the original study topics in psychology came from things that were wrong. So seeing what the Nazis did made people wonder, well, how in the world could people have done that? Seeing symptoms that are harming people for clinical disorders makes people wonder, well, why does this happen? And starts a lot of research. From Milgram studies, from these social psych studies, we've now done other studies to combat some of the things that they found. But really, one of the ideas here was Milgram was thinking that maybe part of the reason so many people were just following orders in these situations with the Nazis and other authorities doing really terrible things to people, like the Holocaust, other genocides, is because people were maybe just following the orders of an authority, and what kind of pressure does authority put on people. So it's a really interesting social psych study, and we'll mention it a little bit, but our focus here is really on the ethics of this individual study.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
And mostly it's taught in situations like this when we're talking about the ethical problems of it. We've seen other studies that really show what Milgram was trying to show better now, but in more ethical ways. So we still do talk about it as an ethically problematic study.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is A word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock 1 step on each error.
That is incorrect.
So before we see some of the examples of the participants, I wanted to make it clear here. The only person who gets shocked in this study is the teacher, is the participant who is acting as the teacher. At the very beginning, they're given a little shock to show, basically to prove to them that the shock generator is a real thing. In reality, this participant is the participant there. He has these switches. And then in the other room is either a tape recorder or an actor or a researcher with a tape recorder, so that the responses are standardized for the learner, who is actually a confederate, an actor who is playing along with the experimenter. And then behind the teacher, so the participant teacher over here, is the experimenter in a white lab coat who had a couple canned responses. We'll hear a few of those right here in the slides. I've got the rest of them listed out, but that was part of the research methods, is just to have a couple standard responses for what the participants, if they might object or what they might do. So the researcher is not holding down these participants, and nobody's actually getting shocked to a point where they're getting harmed, but it is causing psychological harm to these individuals, and you can see that in this video.
Correct. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Of course, this was all a simulation. Nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me.
Go on.
Let me out.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it.
So you can see there's protesting. These people didn't enjoy shocking someone all the way to the end of that. They didn't really like it. They would say, I want to stop. But most of them didn't get up and leave. There was about 33% of them who did get up and leave. Most of them would continue with just that little bit of prodding from the experimenter. So while they're not actually shocking someone, they think they are. They believe that they are hurting someone.
Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Bird,
Let me
car, train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast, bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
All right, so that study showed us some interesting things for social psychology, and we'll mention that a little bit. But I did want to go over a little bit of the research methods of this study. So when a participant would protest, so the person who was thinking that they were shocking someone, when they protested, these were the responses that the experimenter in the white lab coat would say. And you can actually go and really quickly Google Scholar this, Milgram study obedience, and find this original article. It's not that long. You could read it pretty quickly. I think it's 7 pages plus references for the original study. But anyway, these are the responses that the experimenter said. Please continue, or please go on. The experiment requires that you continue. I think we heard that one in the video. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. So the experimenter never did like hold the participant down or like block the door. Just sat there saying these phrases, and just that little bit of authority, that little bit of social pressure led to participants thinking that they were shocking someone very dramatically to harming them. So if participants asked about the pain, the experimenter would say, although the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage, so please go on. So kind of a vague, there's nothing wrong with this, just keep going kind of thing. If they protested because the learner mentioned wanting to stop, said whether the learner likes it or not, so the experimenter says, whether this person likes it or not, you must go until they have learned all the word pairs correctly, so please go on. So these were the canned responses. There wasn't like threatening of the participant. It was just someone in authority. So why is this relevant today? Well, we did build a lot of research off of this. These are relatively gentle prompts, but they definitely coerced people to do things that they wouldn't have otherwise done. So these were volunteers. They weren't told that they couldn't leave. They might have even been told that they can't leave or that they must go on, but they could definitely get up and walk out. So this wasn't a boss. This wasn't a person they already knew. This wasn't like their actual authority. It wasn't someone they knew personally. They didn't have a personal relationship with this authority, but they still behaved in this way in these situations. So social psych-wise, this did help a little bit to understand some of the worst human behaviors. So those Nazis who claimed to just be following orders led to a lot of death, heartache, and evil. So with that, this research led to other social psych research in how to combat some of these social forces. But in our case, we're going to put that aside for right now and focus on the ethics of this. So with this being said, these participants weren't told before they went into this study that they were going to potentially harm someone, but they left thinking that they had harmed someone. They left thinking that they had shocked someone to passing out. They were never told that it was a fake situation. So there was a lot of problems with this study. Also, when the average person learned about the study, they were really astonished. They said, why would we ever do that? Why would you do that to participants? And there was also a bunch of people who said, oh, that was just because of the participants you used. If you did this with women, women wouldn't shock people all the way to the end. So Milgram said, oh, well, let's test that. And then did this study again with women from the area. People came back and said, oh, this wouldn't work with this population in another location in the US. So Milgram tested it again and again. I forget how many total times Milgram did this same specific study in different populations. But it's awful doing that to so many participants when there might have been other ways to see the same thing in a more ethical way that doesn't trick people into thinking that they're hurting someone. So this was done. You'll see news stories or cable TV shows or reality shows or things repeat this study and do it again, even though we know how ethically problematic it is to make someone think that they're hurting someone. So let's stop doing that, essentially. So at this time, review boards didn't exist. This was also a time there was a lot of unethical medical research being done on humans, specifically minority communities, poor communities. So review boards didn't exist up to this point, but there was more and more published outcry because of this study and medical studies, Stanford prison study that we'll talk about in a second. So at this time, there was no requirement to get informed consent from participants. There was no debriefing of the participants. There was deception used with the participants. And this was a pattern in social psych research. It seems for a time there was kind of a, I'm trying to one up how much I can deceive participants, which is really not a good way to do methods. So let's talk about the Stanford prison study. So this was done by Phil Zimbardo in Stanford, essentially taking Stanford students and splitting them into two groups. So one were the jailers, one were the prisoners. The prisoners were actually arrested by real cops that were hired to do that and bring them to the place, blindfolded and brought in. So even though these two students might have been, like later that semester, in the same class together or in previous semesters in the same class, they were assigned the roles of jailers and prisoners, and it led to a lot of abuse of these prisoners. So standing naked, not being able to have clothes, not being able to sleep, verbal abuse, all sorts of abuses of these prisoners, a lot of dehumanization. So it really did let us see some things about the power of groups and authority, in groups, out groups, things like that. But it was a really unethical study. It really harmed a lot of these young people. Since that time, there's been investigations of, say, the methods, looking back at journals, interviews with the people involved in these studies. And there's definitely criticisms of these methods. For example, Dr. Zimbardo was very involved in the study and may have intentionally, there's claims that may have intentionally picked jailers that were more harsh or might be more harsh-like versus prisoners that wouldn't be as harsh. There's also been claims that maybe because of being so involved and acting as a warden encouraged behaviors that might not have happened if they weren't in the same place, which, yes, these are methodological problems, but for our purposes, our focus is the ethical problems of this study leading to these abuse of these prisoners. So when we consider the ethics of any research study, we really need to think about the risks and benefits. So what do you think we mean when we say risks and benefit of the studies? Maybe in your notes, write down a few things right now. So when we're talking about risks and benefits, what we're mainly talking about are the risks of psychological harm to participants, maybe even physical harm, so actually harming the participants. We're talking about the risks of not having the results. So what risks do we take by not knowing these things? When we're thinking about benefits, we're thinking about benefits to the participants themselves. So do they get an educational benefit? Do they learn something from this? Are they gaining a new skill? Do they get treatment for a psychological condition? Let's say you're testing out a new treatment. Well, hopefully they're getting a good treatment, right? If you have a placebo and a real medicine, maybe the people, you tell them that, hey, after you finish this course, anyone who got the placebo will get the real treatment. Something like that, giving them an actual benefit for being in this study. One example of a good participant benefit that I've given in my studies is in the experiment where we were testing out purpose activities. The control group did memory skills activities. We taught them different mnemonics, different memory tricks that come from cognitive psychology that can help them in studying, help them memorizing, helping them in life. So the treatment group, they got purpose activities, hopefully to build their purpose in life. And we saw that it did have an effect. The control group, they also got a benefit. So lots of benefits for participants in that kind of situation. So a payment, gift, or raffle, you might consider that a benefit, and IRB doesn't often consider that a benefit. So with that, any payment you give the participant can't be coercive. So you can't decide to do a really unethical, really harmful study, but pay someone $2 million to do it. They might do it even if it's going to harm them, right? So there can be problems with even payments. But then we also have to consider what's the benefit of having the knowledge. We do now have the benefit of the knowledge of the Milgram study and the Stanford prison study. We know the things we know from those studies. Would there have been more ethical ways to get that information without deceiving participants, without harming participants? Yes, absolutely. We have a little bit more creative methods now and ways to do these kinds of studies to get at the same answers. Now, does it take more time? Does it take more care? Does it take more money? Yes, probably. It might be easier to do this kind of study, but we can find and get the benefits of the knowledge without putting participants at so much risk. And that's one of the big keys of our discussion today. It's a real focus on the ethics of research. We'll talk towards the end about ethics in clinical psychology, like actual practicing counseling or clinical psychology, but that'll be more brief. The Stanovich chapter and book is more on the research end. So those are the risks and benefits to consider. So what are some of the things to consider when treating participants ethically? One thing is confidentiality. So confidentiality is the idea that you shouldn't be able to connect a person's name or identifying information with their data. So if I publish a journal article and I say, in my journal article, my methods section, I say, hey, we got this from this specific high school in Utah. And then I say, there were 4 participants who said this. One of those participants was 18 at the time of the study and was this ethnicity, was in this socioeconomic status. You might be able to go to the roster of that school and be able to say, oh, it was probably like this person or maybe one of these 4 people. You don't want to be identifiable in your data. So make sure when you're publishing, you are not publishing identifiable data. Oftentimes, the things that we do publish are group data. So we say, hey, I have my treatment group and my control group. That treatment group's full of 150 people. The control group's 150 people. The 150 people are pretty similar, and this group got this score, this group got this score. So saying that about a whole group doesn't tell you which participants or who it was in the study. Is not identifiable. So that's usually how we do that to make sure that we're not publishing identifiable data. When you're doing an interview, it might be harder. You might pull out like quotes, but make sure that those quotes aren't identifiable to the person that you're interviewing. Like if they're using names or like, this is the job I had, or I was working here, or this was my grandpa. You want to make sure that that isn't there. You can even do studies from messages posted online. So let's say you wanted to look at the frequency of certain terms within this time and this time within an election year from all the candidates or something like that, or anybody tagging or retweeting these candidates. So you could do that, and then you could even use snippets of that, but you wouldn't want it to be able to be tied back to the original data, like the original person. So another thing to consider is consent versus informed consent. So pause the video for a moment in a second and think about what is consent versus what is informed consent. So pause the video and just in your notes put down what you think it is. All right, so my throat is starting to feel scratchy, probably because I've done this lecture already, and I recorded a couple before this too. So what are the differences? Well, consent is basically agreeing to the thing, agreeing to the study. Yes, I'll do the study. Informed consent is giving a participant all the information that they might need that might influence them to say yes or no, I'll do the study. If you told participants, hey, some of you are going to be in the jail, some of you are going to be jailers, some of you are going to be prisoners, or hey, we're going to tell you you're shocking someone and giving someone pain, they probably would say, no, I don't want to be part of that study, right? But you need to give them all the information they need to be able to participate in the study or not. Generally, for my studies, they're very low risk, the ones that I've done. So I basically tell people exactly what they're going to do. I won't tell them, hey, you're going to do this specific scale, but I'll say something like, you're going to do a survey where you answer questions about maybe how you feel, prosocial behavior, that kind of thing. I'll talk about even sometimes naming variables that I'm going to look at. And I'll say, then you're going to do activities, maybe like some purpose activities or I might not say that they're doing purpose activities. I'll say, then you'll do some interactive activities, a matching exercise like short essays, things like that online. I'll explain as much as I can. I'll tell them also how much. So I'll describe the study in as much detail as I can without getting like boring, essentially. I'll tell them how long it's expected to take. Hey, this survey is going to take 10 minutes. You're going to do one survey and then you're going to do activities 4 days in a row. Each of those activities will be about 15 minutes. Then we're going to follow up again 2 weeks later. That'll be about a 10-minute survey. And then 2 weeks after that, another survey. It'll take about 10 minutes. So your total time is however much it was. I think total was like 3.5 hours over the course of like a month and a half. So I tell them that. I tell them up front, and we're going to be emailing you. We expect you to do this every day. We inform them exactly what's going on and say, hey, will you agree to do the study now that you're informed? Tell them the purpose of the research, what happens to the control versus treatment as well. You might even say, hey, some of you will be in a control group, some of you will be in a treatment group, everybody's going to do activities. If you are in the control group, we'll email you the actual activities afterwards, or the real medicine rather than the placebo. I mean, you wouldn't email a real medicine, but you know what I mean. You give them the real medicine afterwards. So, and then describe the risks and benefits. If there is real risk of harm, you need to let people know that. So let them know the benefits. Hey, in doing these activities, you might learn about yourself. We're going to give you some study tools that you can use, things like that. If there's no benefits, be clear. Say, there's probably no benefits to you. Some of my studies, I've said, we expect no benefits to the participants. These studies will benefit the field of psychology in helping us understand this topic. So I'm upfront about it, saying, hey, I don't expect this to benefit you. So it's voluntary. You can leave at any time. In many of my studies, I remind people that it's voluntary. I say, hey, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. You're about halfway through. Remember, you can leave at any time. And if you have any questions, here's my email. Something like that. So with that, one thing that was used in the past a lot is deception in research, especially for a time in social psychology. It seemed like a one-up game of who can deceive more or get away with more in deceiving participants. Basically, at this point, don't use deception unless it's absolutely necessary. So if there is a question you cannot answer any other way except for using deception, and try as little as you can, like to deceive as little as you possibly can. Tell them as much as you can around the thing you have to deceive about, right? So sometimes you might need to be a little more creative with your methods. You might have to work harder, set up a more elaborate scenario, do multiple studies to target that one variable. But there are ways you can do things more ethically. It might be harder, you might need to be more creative, but please, let's be more ethical with our research than we have been in the past. So it is possible to answer questions without deception. So with using deception, what do you expect the findings to be if you use deception versus not? It better be a really good reason to use deception. Is that risk worth it for the scientific, educational, or applied value? So do not deceive people, especially if you plan on causing physical or emotional distress. Hopefully you're not planning on causing physical or emotional distress, but if you are, or if you think that's a probable thing that might happen, don't deceive. All right, so basically we'll talk about IRBs in a minute, the review boards. It's really, really difficult now to get any kind of deception past IRBs. And that's a good thing. We don't want to be deceiving participants. We don't want them to leave with bad feelings of the field or bad feelings about themselves. All right, so let's talk about sharing data for verification. Many journals now either require or request authors make their data available when you submit a journal article for publication. So the reason these journals do this is because of some data fraud that's happened in the past. Excuse me. It also allows them to verify your findings. So let's say I did a study, I have a bunch of correlations I run, some t-tests to check mean differences or something like that. I can send in my data and I can say, hey, these are my results, this is my paper, I want to publish this in your journal, then the peer reviewers, they can say, all right, I'm going to read your paper. Now I'm also going to run those analyses myself. I'm going to take your data set and check and make sure that your results are correct. I'm going to make sure that you did it right. So that's a really good thing for the field. It allows those other professionals to verify these things. But how do you deal with confidentiality in this kind of case? Your data set is basically an Excel file of your participants' names, maybe their email addresses, maybe their physical addresses, probably their IP addresses, and then all their data, like they scored a 1 or a 2 or a 3 on number 1. They scored like a 5 on number 7, and their scores on the entire scale. So for purpose, they scored this. For mindfulness, they scored this. So how do you keep that confidential if you're sharing data? Well, there's a couple pretty simple ways to do this. You basically just make sure that your data cannot be tied to any individual. So in some cases, you might need to delete things like IP addresses. So that's a pretty easy thing. You just literally delete the column in your data set before you send it off to the reviewers. You delete usernames if they had to create usernames. Some of my projects, I've had them do that. I've had them do emails. Usually I have them put 2 emails for like a longitudinal study because we have to email them the follow-up studies. So their email is listed in the data set. But I delete that before I send it in with my journal article. One thing you can do to make sure your data stays intact is you could make a master list of this person's email is related to ID number 1 or 001 or something like that. Or you can just create ID numbers so that it makes sense. So, oh, this is all the data. These are the scores for participant 007, right? So that you can keep track of participants. They can still use the data, but when they're verifying the data, they don't have access to identifiable information, the people's names, their addresses, their emails, those kinds of things. So delete any columns that could be identifying, create a new ID variable, new grouping variables, things like that. Most of the time you don't share minor data at all. So when I've done studies of high school students, submitted that to a journal, they'll say, hey, will you share your data? And I'll say, nope, this data came from minors, so I'm not going to share it. And usually that's literally just a button to push, say, is this minor data? If so, we don't want it, essentially, to keep that minor data even more safe. So like people under 18. It can be really difficult to share qualitative data in ways that are confidential. Let's say, for example, you've done an interview. Let's say you've done hour interviews about people's lives, and you have 50 interviews. In those interviews, people might be talking about their grandparents, their parents, the place they work, their spouse, and naming them by name. So you can go through and just black out or delete those sections, like have a little redacted all over the document. So you can share it that way. Usually I just haven't ever shared the qualitative data just because if it was ever required, I would do that. I would redact those things, but since it's such a time-consuming process, I haven't ever actually shared qualitative data at this point. So one thing with that, you can ask adult participants if they would be open to you sharing data. As an example, I am currently in the midst of doing a study with heroes. Basically, we're doing, it turns out to be about 2-hour interviews. Some are a little longer, some are a little shorter, with people who've done heroic acts. So we email these people, we say, hey, can we do a Zoom interview? Can we meet you at a place that you're comfortable with? Sometimes it's like their house or like a campus nearby, something like that. And we audio record. So we video record it, we audio record it, and we transcribe it afterwards, and we write notes during it. So these are long life stories, very identifiable information. But the reason we're doing this study is basically there's not a lot known about how heroes develop. So we're asking as many heroes as we can, as much as we can about their lives, so maybe we can find patterns. And we've been able to see some interesting patterns already. But one thing we want to do is share these interviews. We want to be able to put these videos and the transcripts up online so other future researchers can just use the data. They don't have to collect the data. The data's already there for them to collect. We haven't put it up yet. We want to get some more interviews before that and get a couple papers out before we start sharing the data. But for that, in the informed consent form, and in the informed consent form we say, hey, are you willing to be recorded, audio, video, transcribed, all of this stuff? And then we give them a video and audio release form. We say, hey, will you give us permission to post this to a database for researchers to use in the future? And one participant has said no, that they won't, so we're not going to post that. Other ones have signed that release form, so we have that document, and so they have agreed to share that in a non-confidential way. But that would be the only reason you would do that, because you have explicit permission to share it in a non-confidential way. And we were upfront, they have informed consent, so they've done that consent form. They've also done a release form saying yes, absolutely, in multiple places, that yes, they are open to us sharing the data. That would be the only situation you would share it in a non-confidential way. So, some ethics questions, a little bit of a quiz. So if the principal, you do a study in a high school and you ask about aspirations for going into jobs, college, this kind of thing, the principal wants to know the names of students with lower aspirations. Is this appropriate? Should you share that? Hopefully your answer is obviously not. So you could share the group data. So maybe if you have enough participants in each grade, you might even break it down by grade. So the average score for your freshmen, there's 150 freshmen. Their average score was a 3 out of 5. The average score for your seniors was a 5 out of 5, something like that. If there's only like 10 people in any one grade, you wouldn't want to share it, but you could share it as a group. So everybody in your school who did this study, all 200 people in the school who did the study, their average score was this, but you wouldn't share the individual names. Let's say you ask questions about how much a student liked the teacher who was giving the activity that day, and a teacher wants to read the answers to questions about teacher liking. Is that appropriate? No, obviously not. If there's some kind of open-ended responses or numbers there, the teacher might be able to pick out who that student is. If a teacher's like, or if a student's like, I don't like this teacher, I failed my last exam, and I just don't think this teacher likes me, or something like that. That teacher might be able to say, oh, I only have 2 students who failed that exam, so it's one of them, right? You don't want it to be identifiable. So, with that being said, from your reading, what goes into a debriefing? Pause the video really quickly, put it in your notes. All right, so a debriefing is where you explain after the study what happened in the study, what was all happening, what was the true purpose of the study. If you deceived them, be honest about it, tell them why you deceived them, what the purpose was. And a big thing here is fix any damage caused by the study. The participants in our studies, we want them to leave having a positive view of their participation, positive view of psychology. We don't want them going away, like Milgram's participants, thinking that they had hurt someone. That's not good for the field of psychology. That's not good for the person either. So we want them to leave with good feelings towards the field, good feelings about themselves. Maybe in the debriefing you can give them, hey, you did this personality assessment, here are your results. Or, hey, based on this research, we've been learning these things about, here's some memory tools, or some activities you can do at home. So giving them something, some kind of benefit. If they leave it with a new skill or insight about themselves, that's so much better. So, what should Milgram have discussed if using debriefing? Obviously, tell them that they didn't actually shock someone. Show them that it was a tape recording. Show them that it was all a made-up situation. There's a lot of things that Milgram could have discussed with the debriefing. Making sure that they didn't have trauma, maybe giving them free access to 4 therapy sessions, something like that would have been appropriate. So we've mentioned IRBs a few times today. Let's talk about what they are. So before I do a study, I propose my study to an IRB, an institutional review board. I say, hey, my school, hey, Salt Lake Community College, I want to do this study and I want to do these kinds of things with college students. I will keep their data safe in these ways. They'll be fully informed, to give informed consent. They'll all be above 18. A bunch of details about what I want to do in the study and how I will keep participants safe. The IRB then looks at those documents. They look at the risk of the study, the risk of the participants, the benefit of having the data, the benefits to the participants, the benefits of having the data, and then they will often give revision orders. They'll say, hey, I need you to be a little more clear here about what you're doing here, or nope, that doesn't work. You need to revise your methods to not be so deceptive, and then they will approve or reject that proposed study. And if they reject it, you don't do the study. You plan a different study that's more ethical, more careful about your participants. So this can be usually it's a revision process. One thing that I've found I commonly get, I don't know why this has happened more than once, because it's happened I think 3 times now for different studies. The IRB comes back and it says, hey, how are you going to keep participants' data confidential? Where are you storing the data? And so what they're wanting is to make sure that I don't leave like a hard drive with the data like on a table somewhere. So the plan is, well, it's going to be on a password protected computer. Then after I get all the data, it's downloaded onto an encrypted file, like an encrypted hard drive. Then I put that hard drive in a locked physical file cabinet in a locked office. So it's like, it's behind multiple locks. It's not just going to be like lying out. But for some reason, I've forgot to say that a few times. So that's one of the most common revision orders I get. So hopefully, since I'm mentioning it right now, I won't forget that one again. But I usually have some like tweaks or revisions to make it really clear exactly how I'm taking care of participants. So with that, IRBs exist everywhere that receives federal funding for research. So pretty much every single hospital has one of these. Pretty much every single college, pretty much every single university, and any research institute that has federal funding for the research that they do must have an IRB. So IRBs are made of 5 people. So 4 of those people can be in the institution. So I don't actually know what it's made up of at Salt Lake Community College, but for example, let's say one is a professor in the psychology department, the second is a professor in the physics department, the third is a professor in the biology department, and the fourth is a professor in the humanities department. They all know about research and care about research. They're part of the IRB. And then the 5th person is from around the institution, usually the city that the institution's in, that is interested in research. So it can be someone who's done research in the past. Maybe they're a retired professor or a retired person who didn't work at that institution but knows research enough that they would qualify to help take care of people. So IRBs exist in the US. The full board basically means all members of the IRB have to read over that and approve it. Expedite it is it's not as risky of a study, so fewer people need to read it. If it's a very minimal risk study, it might even be exempt from the IRB. The IRB reviews it, says, yep, this qualifies as exempt, you can do the study. So the IRB is a US exclusive organization, but there are similar organizations across the world. So if you are doing cross-cultural research in a different country as well as the US, so maybe you're comparing 2 different populations, you'll probably need to go through a review board in that place where you're doing the study. Sometimes the IRB, some of these organizations are stricter than the IRB. So in some of the cases, you might apply just to the foreign ethics organization. And then you say, hey, my IRB at Salt Lake Community College, this organization said I was good to go. And my IRB will say, okay, give us all the information. But yeah, they're more strict than us, so you're good to go. But a lot of times you'll have to do both. So plan ahead. This is also one good reason to network and work with people actually on the ground in that location, so that you can write the proposal to their ethics organization in the proper language, so that it's a person that you're working with who has worked with that organization before to get that reviewed. So these organizations are now very important for keeping participants safe. They didn't exist back when Milgram and Zimbardo were doing those studies that we talked about. There were also a lot of medical studies that were done at this time that were really, really harmful to marginalized groups, minorities, the poor, and that's really not good. So we're trying to do a better job as fields of taking better care of humans, which I think is really important. As a psychologist, a lot of our motivation is to help people. As we're doing our research, let's help people too. All right, so what could an IRB have done or suggested for Milgram's study? In all honesty, at this point, someone proposes Milgram's study, and IRB will say, just no, you cannot do that. Come back with a better study plan that takes better care of participants. But some things that you could change are debriefing people, obviously, making sure you explain that you have deceived them. Maybe you could give them full informed consent, tell them exactly what's going to happen, or as much as you possibly can. So there's a lot of things an IRB would have changed about Milgram's study. All right, let's talk about some ethical concerns within the profession of psychology. This is both research as well as the profession of psychology. And then we'll get to a few briefly things on doing like clinical psychology or counseling psychology work. So misrepresentation are things like fraud, fabricating data, changing data, or even selecting specific data. So fraud in research is a problem. Misrepresenting data is a problem. Let's look at this example really quick. So there was a time this happened in 2 different studies. One of my studies, I looked at the data after collecting it, and I realized there was a whole lot of people that were scoring 0 on this scale. That this specific scale, a bunch of people were scoring 0, which is really strange because it was supposed to be from 1 to 7. So in looking into it, either the program itself messed up the coding, like turned whatever number they selected into a 0, or maybe as I was scrolling through the back end of the study, I might have accidentally told it to code things as a 0 for some of the participants. So I had maybe like 10% of the participants that had zeros that didn't make sense. So can I just throw out those participants and use the rest of the data? I had a similar thing happen another time where the coding basically flipped. So like a 7 turned itself to a 1, a 1 turned itself to a 7, so it was really confusing. So do I delete those ones that were messed up? In these cases, it probably would have been appropriate to delete those specific cases. But myself, I still felt uncomfortable with that. Because if I messed up on that, did I mess up on any other coding? Did the program mess up on giving me the right numbers? So instead, I just didn't ever use that data. I recollected data. So it was basically money and time lost, and I had to recollect data, making sure everything was coming out exactly, that I was getting the data as it should have been coming out. So let's say you have that case and you see that there's a couple people who are scoring really high or really low, really beyond what you expect. Well, you know, if you deleted those people that were really high or really low, maybe your hypothesis would be confirmed. And it is possible, maybe those are actual outliers, people that it's a mistake in the program. One common practice that I learned in like doing statistical analysis was to use a number, I think like 99 in SPSS, which is a stats program. Use the number 99 to mark missing data, which is really absurd. Like, why did the program want a 99 for missing data? 99 could be a real data point for something. You made $99 or something like that. So there were times that people saw like, oh, 99, there's a whole bunch of people who scored 1 to 7, but then there's these people who scored 99. So they would maybe delete those cases because it was missing data. So you could say it's kind of a gray area. Is it a real outlier? If so, you can probably delete it, but but you don't choose people to delete. You don't change the data in ways to make your hypothesis work how you want. That is misrepresenting your data, misrepresenting your finding. And it shows that you're not interested in the actual science of it. Sometimes hypotheses don't come out how you expect. Sometimes you expected a relationship and nothing was there. That's part of the process of science. Maybe that relationship doesn't actually exist. Or maybe you messed up with your methods. Maybe you do another study and find, oh, yep, I did a better job this time with my methods. It's a lot more clear this relationship exists. But you've got to be honest about these things. So a really bad example of research fraud is this individual who fabricated data. So part of how this was found was there were basically people saying, I think this is what this person's doing. Not all of the studies make sense. Some of their data looks really similar. People were bringing up concerns. And so others looked at the data files for the various studies and saw, oh, you know what? It looks like chunks of these data files for completely different studies that are supposedly completely different people were literally copied and pasted from an Excel file to another. Sometimes like reorganized, but that's essentially what was going on there. The problem is it wasn't only this individual's research. They were collecting data for their grad students as well. So there were tons of papers, tons of work, tons of conference presentations based off of fabricated data. And that really hurts the view of the field. It also hurt the careers of the people who got their PhDs. If they got their dissertation with fabricated data, it doesn't look like the people who were under them knew that this fabrication was happening. So but their papers have been removed. Journals have written retractions, things like that. But that's not good for the field of psychology. It's not good for the science of psychology. It's not good for learning and advancing understanding of humans. So let's not do these things. Another aspect of misrepresenting is plagiarism. So this is when you misrepresent another person's work as your own. So oftentimes we think of this as word-for-word plagiarism. Say I take this chunk, these couple sentences from an article, I paste it in my new paper, and I don't cite it. I have committed word-for-word plagiarism. What most often I see happening is students read multiple papers on an idea, and then they put that idea into their paper. They've written it in their own words, but these ideas came from those original papers. As an example, let's say I'm writing a paper on the side effects of Ritalin, and I find two papers that are talking about how, in a lot of detail, how Ritalin affects the side effect of growth. It can slow growth in people. So in my paper, I write in my own words, one of the most common side effects of Ritalin is the potential for stunted growth, right? I write that, I've written it in my own words, but then I don't cite it. I didn't do the data collection to find that Ritalin has a potential to stunt growth in people. So I need to cite and say, oh, this came from these two research articles that I read, or from this book, or from this website. So this is really important for students' work. Also, there is the potential for paying someone to write your paper. Don't do that. You're misrepresenting another person's work as your own. Don't have an AI write your paper. So yeah, that's misrepresenting some work as your own when it's not your own. So at an undergraduate level, generally we're not expecting students to be producing their own data or brand new ideas. So most of your papers are describing previous research, previous findings, putting things together from other researchers. So almost your entire paper should be full of those parentheses with the authors and the year, those in-text citations. You might look at it and say, there's a lot of in-text citations. If I see a lot of in-text citations, I'm glad. It looks like the student is doing a good job reading research, not misrepresenting the work. If I see a paper with very few in-text citations, I wonder, and I read into it and I say, are they misrepresenting a person's work? And are they forgetting to cite things? And that's often the case, is students are just not realizing that this thing that they wrote came from these other ideas. So that's still plagiarism. Don't do it. So think about this. Did you write the words? No, I copied and pasted them. Well, then you definitely need to use quotation marks, the parentheses, authors' names, the year, and the page number. Did you write the words? Yes, I wrote this idea in my own words, but did you think of the idea? Well, no, I put together I understood about the side effects of Ritalin because of these papers I read. So nope, I didn't think of that idea, so I need to provide a citation. So most of your papers, most of the work you're going to be doing follows this path. You're paraphrasing the work of other people, putting together those ideas from multiple sources, so you have maybe those 3 articles cited at the end of your sentence. So did you think of this brand new idea? Is it new data that you collected? Then you don't need a citation. But that's probably not the case for most undergraduate psych students. All right. So thinking about ethical research questions, what kind of research results should be published? Would it ever be appropriate to not publish a result? So pause the video for a minute, think about that, put it into your notes. One of the big problems I'm getting at here is called the file drawer problem. A lot of useful findings are not published in journal articles. So journal articles, they generally like to publish things that the hypotheses come out, something new or different or unusual, and a lot of that is because people tend to buy access to those articles. So generally the articles that you're accessing, you're getting it through the library's access to those journals. But those journals are trying to make money, so a lot of it comes down to that problem of them trying to make money. So they're often not publishing findings that just didn't come out the same way, or the hypotheses didn't work out, or the findings were null, there was no correlations, those kinds of things. So a lot of useful findings are not published because the experiment was unsuccessful. I tested these 2 groups, I thought it would work, didn't work. The groups were no different. The journal's going to look at that and say, well, this isn't very interesting. It might not sell journal articles, so they're not going to publish it. The results didn't match the hypothesis. I hypothesized this relationship, but I actually found the other relationship. Maybe I don't have a good explanation for that. Now, if you explain it well, you can probably get that still in a journal, but especially null results. When you expected a relationship, you expected something to happen, and nothing happened, you probably are going to have a hard time getting a journal to publish that. Now, that being said, now there are journals specifically out there to publish null results in, so that you can disseminate null results. Another place you can let people know of null results is like conferences. But this can be a big problem, not getting null results out there, because some of those findings might be important to know. Let's say, based on all the articles you've read, you think this new education method might be really good at helping 4th graders in some specific way. So you test it out, you find it didn't work. But no journal is going to publish it, you don't write it, you don't present it. Then 2 years later, or maybe at a different school 2 years later, someone else is like, oh, I think based on all these articles, this specific thing will help with 4th graders. They test it, doesn't work out, and they don't publish it. 2 years later, another person tries it, and then another person tries it. These people would be wasting time on something that others have found doesn't work, because that null result is not published. So this is a big problem, not just in social psychology. This is actually a problem in all of the sciences, that a lot of null results just aren't published. So the things that get published are those things that are different or new or changed or worked out the way that were hypothesized. And that's a really big problem in the field at large, because some of us are wasting time doing things that other people already found didn't work, or didn't work the same way we expected. Now, can you put null results with results that worked out? Yeah, let's say some of your results worked out, some of them didn't. Report all of those, right? That's going to be a little more likely to get published in these journals. But there are these other ways to disseminate. You can write your own white paper, say like, hey, this wasn't peer reviewed, and put it on your website so people can access it. They can even cite it. Things like that, going to journals that do publish these null results. So there are ways. So who should be in charge of which results are published? So we've talked about a lot of different things. We've talked about IRBs are involved in research, the researchers, the participants, funding agencies. We haven't talked about them too much, but they're involved in research because they generally give the funding. Then you use that money to go and do your research. So who should be in charge? Well, the researchers. The researchers should be the ones in charge of what results are published. And as researchers, we need to do the publishing of those results. Our null results, our good results, the things that happen the opposite of the way we expected, we need to get those out there. So we're the first ones in charge of what results are published. Second is peer reviewers. So the peer reviewers will look at that and say, well, maybe you're claiming too broadly, or this worked in this situation, but you're claiming it'll work everywhere in the US, but you don't have the evidence to say that. So tone it back a bit. So peer reviewers next. Maybe the peer reviewers say, no, sorry, you didn't do enough work on this paper. You really need to give us more evidence to be able to say this is an actual finding. That can happen too. Your paper can be rejected by peer reviewers. Publishing should not be determined by the funding organizations. So they might have an interest in a lot of the funding agencies that I've got funding from, fund a lot of pro-social behavior research. But if I find that something didn't work out, this funding agency shouldn't tell me, hey, you can't publish that, right? As well, the government shouldn't be stepping in and saying you can or cannot publish that data, right? If it's data that the researchers and the scientists need and could use, that should be published. The government shouldn't have a hand in that. The participants of the research shouldn't have a hand in saying don't or do publish this. And I have an asterisk there because let's say you have, for example, a participant and you've done interviews and you say, hey, can you give us a release to publish this information? One thing that we'll do is we'll send our paper to you before to correct anything. So you write up your paper, their data is really important for what you're going to claim, then you send it to that participant and say, hey, these are the quotes we're using from you. Did you want to revise your statements in any way? Maybe they come back to you and say, I really don't feel comfortable about being part of this research anymore. I really don't want you to use my data. That's a kind of case that, to be ethical towards your participants, it might end up in that kind of case stopping that research from happening. That's really unlikely to happen. Any given paper is probably not hinging on one specific participant, so if they don't want to be part of your study anymore, removing their data should be fine. It'd be very unusual for it to be like such a key piece of it. So that is a lot about the ethics in the field of psychology, specifically around research. I did want to make a couple points around ethics for practicing psychologists, so counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists. So really briefly here, because if you do a clinical PhD program, a clinical master's program, a PsyD program, you'll have dedicated courses specifically to ethics, go over stories of poor ethics, kind of like we're going over poor ethical stories for research right here. So I just want to touch on these really briefly. So psychologists shouldn't be making false or deceptive statements concerning their training, their experience, their competence. If you don't have training in doing mindfulness exercises or cognitive behavioral therapy or aversion therapy, don't say that you do. You don't lie about your degrees, you don't lie about your credentials. Tell the associations and institutions that you're affiliated with. For example, something like Autism Speaks. If you're affiliated with them, that would be a good thing to let people know, because maybe someone would or would not want to work with you based on your affiliation with that organization. Don't claim you're offering services that you don't. So if you do play therapy, you can say you do play therapy. If you don't do play therapy, don't say you do play therapy, for example. This is something you should be able to ask any doctor. Psychologist, medical doctor, is a scientific and clinical basis for the recommendations they're giving you. So asking them, are there other potential options for treatment? What does the research say about this? What are the risks of these kinds of things? That should be upfront and honest. Fees and publication of research findings. Not all clinical psychologists, even though they might go through a PhD and do research, they might not be still doing research. So not everybody's going to be publishing research. So there's a couple other slides here that go into these points in a lot more detail about clinical psychology. I'm just going to flip through them. Feel free to pause the video and read each of these slides. But again, like I said, if you go into a clinical program, you're going to be diving into this in a lot more depth. So advertising wise, be honest about what you're advertising. Don't try to find people that look like they are, well, here, read this one. And again, you can pause to read the whole thing. If you're doing any kind of media presentation, same thing, being honest about your data, your credentials, following ethical rules, confidentiality, that kind of thing. This first one is basically saying on your own website for your clinic, you wouldn't solicit testimonials from current patients or their families because you have a form of authority over the clients that you're working with. You don't want to coerce them to doing things. So you wouldn't go for in-person solicitation. You wouldn't go to a funeral home every time you see a funeral happening and offer your services as a grief counselor. That'd be really inappropriate. These apply to other things. I'm just giving a few examples. So conflicts of interest can be in a lot of different ways. So again, you'll dive into this in a lot more depth in a clinical program. So multiple relationships, this would be something like you shouldn't be dating a client, you shouldn't be the therapist for your sibling, that kind of thing. And a big key for a lot of these is to treat people ethically, to not have coercive force over them, not be able to exploit them. So let's say, I don't know if this would actually fit this, but here's an example of this multiple relationship. Let's say you have a client, they're talking to you about their workplace, and you learn that the person that they work with is your brother. Well, that's probably a conflict of interest, a multiple relationship here. So you should probably not be their therapist. You could say something like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. Let's move you to another therapist who is not me. Let's have you be with my neighbor, the office right down here. Would you consent to transferring over to that person as your therapist, just as one example. Also being ethical when if you have to testify in front of a jury, maintaining the levels of confidentiality and things that would be required in that sort of situation. So a lot today on the specific details of ethics among doing research in psychology, and a little bit of a taste for the ethics in practicing psychology as a counselor or a clinical psychologist. So again, you'll learn a lot more about that in a clinical psych program. But for our purposes in this class, we're going to focus a lot more on research methods themselves. So you've got a lot more knowledge on the ethics. Let's do a better job as a field of psychology of treating people well, of helping people and not hurting people in any kind of way, especially when we're researching and trying to learn things about humans.